As I was saying, it is an absolute tremendous pleasure to welcome you, Josh, with us. You're absolutely the kind of person we need to hear from, because of not just for who you know and your insights into, or glimpse, if I put it, into government, but also as a economist who's looked into carbon pricing a lot. There's so much more that that you know that we need to hear about. So just in case people aren't completely up to speed on who Josh is, Josh is an economist. He worked for the think tank Policy Exchange, which is sort of somewhat right-leaning in its advice and ethos. And now he works for the Grantham Institute, which is part of LSE, and obviously that's spot on the whole issue of addressing climate change and everything. His work at the Policy Exchange included a report on carbon pricing, which ended up with a policy recommendation, which is very similar to our fee and dividend, which we're now calling the climate income. So this is just brilliant that we can have you giving us your knowledge and wisdom, Josh. So thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, thank you for inviting me.
We've agreed to make it a bit of an interview to kind of mix things up a bit, so it's not just a talk. I was thinking we'll probably finish at least by 8:30. Is that good? I want to leave loads of time for Q&A, because it really is just more of the interview, but interviewed by everybody, not just me asking the obvious questions. Does that sound a good plan?
Good enough, thank you.
Great. So I want to start, as we're talking about this sort of glimpse into government and everything, what actual kind of access have you had over the years, partly to government itself and partly to conservative sort of policy making on the more politics side? We're working with Policy Exchange.
Sure. So
kind of thing.
On the whole, it's pretty good. I think whatever institution you work at, my experience typically has been that policymakers are generally pretty open to a conversation with people who are trying to put forward constructive ideas. I think the challenge for a lot of us is the extent to which we want to maintain and curry favour whilst at the same time holding people to account. How do we have a relationship with policymakers where we want to keep them accountable? We want to say, you're not going far enough. But equally, we don't want to push too hard in that, when we are looking to them for insights, that we don't have that kind of relationship. So I think whatever institution you work at, whatever organisation, you're always going to tread that fine line between accountability and sort of relationship building. So I think that's just kind of a general principle. I certainly think, having been at Policy Exchange and having had the current administration over the last 10 years, that gained a lot more access, not so much to the civil servants, but to the SPADs and the people who work for the ministers. I think they see, kindred spirit's not the right word, but they see someone who's thinking in the same kind of mindset. And certainly that was my desire to work there, really, was that, the politics might not necessarily be my politics, but they have access, and I want to be as impactful as I can be. And that was one way of doing so. I think what's helpful to kind of bear in mind, whatever organisation you work at, is you can still frame things in a narrative that you think the government might respond to. So a lot of the work that we do at the moment is around what we call kind of economic opportunities of net zero, really trying to frame things in around a narrative of growth and enterprise and kind of, how the UK forges a new path after Brexit. That's kind of a narrative we think works with the current government, works with the current civil service. And so it doesn't matter what kind of, political persuasion you are, you can always try and find a hook, a narrative that you think will resonate. The underlying message will, gets you to the same place, but you kind of have to think quite cleverly about how you frame things. Obviously, if you had a change of government, you might change the kind of wording a little bit. even though the pathway is still there. So on the whole, yeah, policymakers tend to be very open, but equally they're very constrained in what they can do. They're there to kind of please the minister, and so you need to work on the SPADs, the special advisors to the ministers, as much as you do the policymakers. So yeah, that's my kind of reflections, I think.
So what do you feel is well, obviously it's not going to be a single answer, but the kind of range of feelings that the top Conservative policymakers and even ministers are thinking on climate change at the moment?
I guess I kind of have a natural skepticism, so it's kind of teasing out what I think is just good sentiment and whether underlying that is a genuine desire for strong climate action. And I think it certainly feels things are going in the right direction. Certainly, we're not going as far and as fast as we need to be. But I think, it's one thing that the government announcements and the Chancellor's statements and things reflect climate change and talk about them, so you can kind of take some confidence that they're on the agenda. Obviously, we need to then see the policy to take for those actions to be met, and that hasn't really been forthcoming yet. We've had a net zero target last year. We haven't seen any policy as yet that shows we're going to meet that, but it's certainly in the mind of the public, which has then pushed the government to act. So I think, organisations like yourselves, Extinction Rebellion last year had a massive impact, I think, on creating that political space for the government to legislate for net zero without worrying it had legitimacy within the broader public. So I think it could be a lot worse is I guess where I end up with things. I think there needs to be a bit more funding commitment relative to other countries. France have and Germany put forward much more ambitious kind of green fiscal stimulus packages post-COVID. The UK is lagging behind, although we're going to be having an autumn statement and a comprehensive spending review very soon. So I think when it comes back to this first question about without holding them policymakers to account without burning bridges, I guess I'll wait until we see the spending review and the budget, and that will really give us a good sense of whether things are, if there's any real action and ambition behind the words, I think.
Yeah. And then what's the latest on the replacement of the ETS, the emissions trading scheme?
So I think the government's plan is certainly their first best solution will be a UK ETS linked to the European Union equivalent. That's their primary objective. I think if that fails, which it's certainly possible, then they will move to a UK only ETS that isn't linked, which wouldn't be a very good solution in my view. And then their very last resort in a no deal would be a carbon tax. So it's obviously the direction of the negotiations changes weekly. Certainly won't be putting any money on any sort of outcome at the moment, but it's very difficult to see how the UK could link an ETS if there's a significant divergence in standards or regulations in whatever in the negotiations. I think that's likely to preclude any kind of agreement if the UK deviates in climate ambition or workers' rights or labour standards. Those kinds of things will make a linking agreement much more difficult.
Yeah. So your policy exchange report was sort of on that topic of what should replace ETS after Brexit.
Yeah.
And obviously that hasn't been implemented or adopted. So what do you feel was the reason it didn't get?
Yeah. So it's just an aversion to taxation more generally. I don't think there's not necessarily shortcomings of the policy proposal, not just the policy exchange one, but the broader fee and dividend. That with the right design can counteract some of the drawbacks of taxation. But the government has an aversion to carbon taxes and taxes more generally, and that's just a fact. So raising taxes is a very difficult thing in any context. I guess what I personally find very frustrating is there's quite a disconnect between policy making and reality, in the sense that the government often talk about what's the least cost path to get to decarbonisation. How do we reduce the costs to taxpayers? And that's very much baked into the policy direction. What's the least cost option? But carbon pricing is a policy that will deliver you a lower cost option than subsidies, for example. But subsidies are much more acceptable to public. So on the one hand, they are espousing a rhetoric around low cost, but they're not willing to take the difficult decisions to keep the costs low. And in fact, the costs go up because we revert to policies that are harder to sell to the public. So there's going to come a point in time where these really difficult decisions are going to have to be made if we're going to get to net zero. We've done the easy bit now with the power sector. If we're going to go much further, there's going to be big changes to the whole system, which are going to change in our lives. And government has to make difficult decisions, of which carbon pricing is one of them, and raising that carbon price.
Yeah. Now, I've heard you speak before, and something that really struck me was you're talking about the barrier of the Treasury, more a sort of civil service Treasury culture rather than a political thing. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. So I guess the Treasury as an institute have a message of, have a method of working that they're very accustomed to. And so they kind of, their mindset, policy, I guess this is true of all policymakers, is they kind of used to a fairly rigid structure and fairly rigid way of thinking. So when it comes to kind of proposals that break some of these norms, it's very difficult for them to kind of fit that in their decision-making criteria, if you like. So I'll give an example with regards to what we're talking about, the kind of hypothecation of tax revenue is an anathema to Treasury, thinking that is just not what happens. By good accountancy practice, you don't earmark or hypothecate that revenue. And that is baked into the Treasury thinking with regards to any taxation. So it's very difficult to get them to overcome some of that thinking when we're talking about recycling some of this revenue, even though in other countries this is considered to be quite a normal practice with carbon pricing to improve the public acceptability. So I guess it's our job, yours and mine and others working out there, is to show governments, and this is what we often ask for, is give me an example of other countries that have done this. I think there's a reluctance to be the first mover with a lot of things. They want to see where it's demonstrated and hopefully demonstrated successfully in other countries to make the case for why the UK should do it. So particularly on our proposal, the dividend is very difficult to sell. Treasury don't like it. And historically, the Treasury's been a very influential department going back, many prime ministers and many issues. The Treasury holds so much sway. And so if they're not on board with an idea, it doesn't matter how good it is, how well you sell it, it's not going to happen. So that's the challenge. I think one opportunity is, timing in any policy decision is a critical thing. Is there a window for politicians to act? Is the public support, etc.? So what's the window for carbon pricing? Well, you've kind of now got net zero, you've got Brexit. These are windows to try and change how things are done. I don't think it necessarily will, but we've got as good a chance now as we probably will for the foreseeable future, I think.
Yeah. So I'm going to leave the kind of how to implement the policy to one side, and hopefully a lot of that will come up in the Q&A. And I'd like to move on now to the CCL policy itself, or well, broadly we talk about fee and dividend or carbon income. And what do you feel are we'll start with the key advantages of that approach as an economist?
To the climate change levy?
Well, to have both the tax would be how an economist would
yeah,
and a dividend to citizens.
So, yeah, in principle, it's a very good idea, not necessarily from an economist perspective, but more from a political economist perspective. So, recycling back the revenue is probably not what a classic economist would argue. I think I can't remember who says it, but they use the metaphor of once you've plucked the chicken, and you want to do it for at least as few hisses as possible, why would you then give it away? And with taxation, once you've gone through the pain of raising that revenue, why would you give it all away? That's kind of how Treasury, one of the reasons why there's kind of obstacles to it. From a political economy perspective, you want to try and overcome some of the barriers to that opposition. And some of the barriers are it disproportionately affects poorer households. And that's certainly true of energy expenditure, less true of food and transport. But certainly there are these barriers to implementing it. It's very transparent about where these costs are borne. That's why it's unpopular. With subsidies, you can kind of mask it. With taxes, it's very transparent. So who faces these costs makes it very difficult to implement, particularly the backlash from low-income households or low-income countries more generally. So we've seen France is obviously the most cited example, but we've seen fuel protests in other countries in Latin America. Same with food price spikes. So consumers are very sensitive to any changes in commodity prices, and they'll let politicians know. The recycling idea is one way to overcome some of these challenges. You can either target it by giving more to lower income households so that they're net beneficiaries of the policy. This is obviously a much more progressive way of doing it, or you could give everyone the same sum of money, which is slightly less progressive, but then administratively it's a lot more, it's less complex to do because you have to differentiate the amounts per the households. I guess the challenge from a practical perspective is how do you really identify those houses that how do you identify the households that are most vulnerable? That's quite a difficult thing to do because you could have a household that has similar incomes, but equally they might live in very different types of housing. And so you can get a house that has the same income, but one's in fuel poverty and one's not in fuel poverty. So there are the other characteristics you need to take account for. So the challenge for policymakers is identifying those people really, and then getting the money to them in an efficient way.
Yeah. Do you feel that what you call it recycling, and I think we call it the kind of dividend or the climate income, does that not only allow you to sort of get away with putting in on this fee or tax, but to make it eye-watering levels, which is what would be needed to drive carbon out of the economy?
Yeah, I think, I guess where we're coming from is to prevent some of those, if you really wanted to do all of this with carbon pricing alone, you'd have to have a very, very high carbon price to get some of this decarbonisation. Now, if you have set of complementary policies that work alongside the carbon price, you can have a lower carbon price effectively, because some of these other policies will help. So I think what we need to bear in mind is carbon pricing is good. It should be at the forefront of policymakers' mind in how we get to net zero, but it needs to be supported by other policies, and that'll help bring down some of these costs induced from a high carbon price. So a good example is how the UK has got rid of coal off the system. So it's a nice case study actually for the balance between subsidies, regulations and taxes. So you had a high carbon price which made coal uncompetitive against gas. At the same time, you had subsidies for low carbon technology. So when the coal was becoming not very competitive, you had a good, cheaper alternative to switch to in the form of renewables because of the subsidies. Then you also had regulations on the coal-fired power stations in the form of large plant combustion directive, made it more expensive to run these plants for longer periods of time. And then against the backdrop of, I guess, worry that the carbon price might not get too high, then there was a regulation of phasing out coal by 2025 as a backstop. So you can see that in one example, you've got a nice interaction of different policies to help you get there. There's probably a more efficient way that the government could do it, but this was probably their way of choosing it. So you didn't have to have a really high carbon price because it was supported by some other policies.
Do you see there are other particular weaknesses in a carbon price and a dividend that you haven't mentioned?
Yeah, so the main one I think is identifying the households, making sure they receive it in time, because in many ways the timing aspect of it is crucial, because you want households to receive some of the payment prior to the tax coming into place, so that they can use some of those funds for energy efficiency if that's what you want them to use, so that those measures are in place before the tax starts. So that's one thing. How do you get the timing right? How do you identify those households? That's one issue. The second issue is how do you communicate with citizens how that tax revenue is being used and what it's being used for? I think lots of people have different views on what the best use of that money is. Do you spend 100% of it on the citizens? Do you spend 50% on citizens and 50% on industry, or 50%? How you split that is quite a difficult question, and one that reflects, I guess, the political economy. So in Canada, for example, industry and consumers were a big potential obstacle, and so much of the money is directed towards those. In the UK, the politicians have to make a judgment who they think is going to be the stakeholder that's going to be most vocal in opposition, and that's where, in a slightly cynical way, some of the money should be directed to. So they're the considerations, I think, with recycling or dividend. I mean, these terms are all interchangeable, really. There's hypothecation, there's earmarking, there's dividend. So just for point of clarification, if I use any of those, I mean the same thing.
Yeah. Now, our organisation is quite dominated by America because it's so much more successful there, and it's where the CCLs come from. And the narrative there, because they generate a lot of their own oil and coal and gas, it's quite easy to talk about the fee being charged at the oil well or the coal mine, and then distributed to everybody. Whereas I would assume in Britain, the majority would be implemented at the port. Do you have a feel for how much of our energy is imported and how much we make ourselves in terms of carbon fossil fuels?
Yeah, so in terms of electricity, which arguably the electricity we import does come from fossil fuels, even though it's counted as zero carbon for the UK's purposes, about 7% of our electricity comes from overseas. In terms of oil and gas imports, we went from being a net exporter to a net importer, I think, in about 2006. Once we'd exhausted all the North Sea gas, we then started importing a lot of our gas. So I think about 40% of our gas comes from Norway. Then about another 40 comes from the UK, and then the rest is kind of comes from a variety of other sources. Whenever you read in the media or the talks of the UK relying on Russian gas, it's a massive red herring. We get about 1% of our gas from Russia. So any concerns we have about the kind of geopolitics of that, it's certainly overplayed. It's not really a big factor for the UK.
Were those numbers including the petroleum industry for petrol and diesel?
No, I'm not sure. I don't know that off the top of my head. Gas and electricity, I know more, but I'm sure the other numbers will be available from Bays or somewhere.
Yeah. And then, of course, all the products with their embedded carbon footprints as well. So do you see an easy way of applying the fee at the ports?
Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult one, because in the UK, most of the tax is applied upstream. So at the point of production, that's where and point of generation, rather than on the consumer. Now, obviously, those costs pass through to consumers eventually through higher prices and things like that. I think typically most people call for a tax to be applied for as far upstream as you can, and so I think that's by textbook, that's kind of what you would do. The reality is you'd probably have a bit of both, really, because you want to try and change people's behaviour. So, for example, flight taxes, if you have a frequent flyer levy or something like that, because there is no carbon tax on the fuels that airlines use, you could levy what is effectively a carbon tax on consumers for flying, and that would be a downstream tax, and that has the benefit of consumers feeling that tax, so to speak. Now, again, you get into arguments over equity, whether this is disproportionately affecting certain income groups, whereas a frequent flyer levy, I think, can kind of get around some of these things. But yeah, I think the reality is you have carbon taxes applied in different places in the system, but ideally you would have as many upstream as you can.
Yeah. And my last question before we open it up: what do you feel is the timescale? Because the time really is running out for us to decarbonise the economy, and I always felt that our CCL policy was looking a bit more long term than an immediate sledgehammer, partly because of the increase in levels year by year, rather than imposing it overnight, which I think would be economically quite foolhardy anyway. So what's the sort of time scale do you think that a ramped up carbon fee could decarbonise the economy? Are we talking about decades, or could it be done sooner?
Yeah, I think, net zero in the UK by 2050, I think, is achievable. I certainly think whatever the carbon price is, it's not going to necessarily get you there any quicker, because you're going to face backlash along the way, which might slow things down if you try and raise the price too quickly. Obviously, what you need over time is a steadily rising price in line with other policies. I think 2050 is a realistic start date for where we can get to. There's no reason why we can't bring that forward if new technologies come to market and the prices fall of other things. So I think, that's realistic. There's arguments whether that's fair in the global context, given our history of emissions. XR have been calling for 2025 and things like that. But from my perspective, perhaps, slightly conventional view that 2050 seems a fair place to start.
Right. Well, this is tremendous. Judy or Louisa, do you want to take over with a sort of compare with the general Q&A?
I've got a few points.
Okay.
If that's okay.
So I think we'll do it. If someone's off mute, that's an indication that they are eager to ask a question.
They can raise their hand virtually as well.
Right.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye, or maybe if Gina could keep an eye while I'm talking, and I'll keep an eye while everybody else is talking.
Excellent. Okay.
I'll just start my videos. Hopefully it will work. So I was just going to pick up on a few things like the weaknesses of a carbon fee and dividend, Josh. So one of the ones about receiving a dividend in time prior to the carbon tax biting, I would say that was always the one that my other half would talk about when I talked about carbon fee and dividend is, but what if you have the price rising first, and then where people can have this money? And I know that, and I think, I believe it's James Collis from EU, pointed out that Canada gave it out first. They sort of made an advance payment of the dividend, so to combat that very thing, which is obviously something we'd be promoting too. And communicating the policy effectively to citizens is it's foremost on my mind, being, with my background in marketing. But certainly, I know Canada is saying it's got to be as transparent as possible. So it came in their tax return, or however the tax is done, and you've got to have a very clear line saying this is your dividend, not get swallowed up, and make it as regular as possible. They wanted to go for not an annual payment but a monthly payment, so people keep reminded that this is one of the ways that is combating climate change, and at the same time hopefully protecting the vulnerable. So yeah, what do you think about those two thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the payment in advance, I think, is most important if you're wanting energy efficiency measures to be used to be implemented with the money, because obviously they take time to implement. So if you're not expecting people to use the money for energy efficiency to offset some of the policy costs of the carbon tax, then it's less important to have the initial upfront costs. The first payment can be made afterwards, if you like, but if it's for energy efficiency, that takes time. So that's the most important thing for with regarding the payment prior to that. And then on the communication thing, I think, like you say, what Canada have done, British Columbia have done really well, is they have a very clear, transparent document that outlines exactly where the money's going and how much of it. And that document has to be signed off and ratified in Parliament. It's all publicly available. Anyone can go and see it. And that's quite a good, I think the more open and transparent democratic processes are, the more likely you are to get the buy-in from the consumers. I think what people are worried about is this money just goes into a black hole and they have no idea of where it's going, which is what happens currently. I think lots of the polling suggests that if people know their money for a certain measure or carbon tax is going to go for green infrastructure, or it's definitely going to go back to help low-income households, there's much greater acceptability of that policy. So there's the Zero C Commission. I'm sure you've come across it. They've done a lot of polling on this kind of thing. So it's probably worth reflecting on that as well.
I think, yeah, James has got a question. If you want to say something, James.
I was just reinforcing what Josh was saying. That's exactly what the researchers in Canada found, that communication about the reason and the objective behind the policy was key to public support. Without it, they got much less public support. It's absolutely crucial to have good quality public communication.
Yeah. I think a lot as well, just communicating that the policy is successful. So in the UK, we've got a really good story to tell in that this policy has done a really, really good job in making sure coal has been driven off the system in a rapid time. We now have gone from, I think over 80% reduction in coal from 2012 to 2020. We couldn't have done that without a carbon price. So if people can see that the policy works, that's another thing to help build a narrative and build support.
That's widely accepted in environmental circles around Europe. They quote the UK as absolutely driving coal out of the market very efficiently for exactly that reason.
There's also dare I say it, there's also a kind of a problematic part of the history as well, where coal mines are being shut down and communities decimated. So that's not the right word to use the word decimated, but I think there is also a political lesson there that we have got to look after people, because a radical shift in the basis of our economy will leave vulnerable people poorly off. So the people who are living on financial precipices at the moment, who aren't necessarily the poorest people, and I read recently of the idea of a poverty tax or poverty premium, I think it is, where because you can't, you don't have the money to buy things in bulk or prepay stuff or switch from an uneconomical system to an economical system like heating, for instance, then you end up paying more when you have less money about it. Is that something that you work with as well, Josh? This idea of a poverty premium when you're talking about vulnerable people?
Not really. I guess I only look at the kind of distribution of these costs and from a purely kind of carbon tax perspective. So I don't know the kind of broader landscape. I think what's interesting with bearing that in mind is how, I guess, the framing we use is the money from the carbon tax can be used to ensure that the transition is a just one. And so using that kind of idea, I think, is what we've found to be quite a useful one. And then more broadly, whether recycling the revenue opens up a much broader discussion on universal basic income type arguments. And this would be a very, very modest form of that. And certainly the amount you'd get wouldn't be enough to form a universal basic income. But I think that it starts to open up a conversation about that, which obviously is kind of a fringe conversation, but hasn't really gone beyond that.
I think we had another question. Sorry, I'm just having a look at chat. So we had
his hand up as well.
Okay, I'll just go for Wolfram, and then Ken, and then whoever else has got their hand up. So Wolfram, once we've gone to more, John goes, right, okay, we'll go back to yours, Wolfram. Ken Huggins says, good communication equals telling the truth. XR's first demand. I have a little bit of a problem with them calling demands. We're much more touchy-feely than demands, but yes, absolutely. Well, we've got 2 questions on the climate assembly. Is any, before we go on to the climate assembly and perhaps the effectiveness of that, has anybody got any more? Yes, economic. Okay, go for it, Judy.
Yes, I'm just wondering, where do we focus our lobbying? What we're supposed, what we aim to do is lobby through our MPs, and we've been working on a great what should be a very powerful point, which is a consultant document, a document consulting on the fee and dividend, or moving to a different kind of ETS, featured CCL and actually gave us a whole paragraph saying that our idea had merit, but the government wasn't going to do it. Mm-hmm. So we've been advised that this was something we really should actually highlight and see that it's seen clearly by a lot of MPs and the public, that the government actually recognizes that this is a good policy. So one of the things we've been wondering, and this is what I wanted to ask you, is who we work through our MPs. Is it the Treasury in particular that we should ask our MP to convey this to? Who are we lobbying particularly?
Yeah. As many as you can, I think. So certainly your MPs are a good route to go down. But yeah, if you could establish meetings with Treasury officials, that would be a useful thing, and the special advisors of some of the ministers. I mean, it's very difficult to. The thing is, they're so busy, particularly the special advisors. They don't necessarily respond, even to people they know. So it's not, it's not that it wouldn't be a response to you or me. It's just that they're very time pressured. So MPs,
we go through our MPs. We're asking our MPs to forward our questions and concerns and raise these questions. So who should we go through to? You take.
I go through MPs.
I mean, are we asking our MP to aim our concerns to the Treasury in particular?
Can I follow that up, because it's on exactly the same issue, because I've had this exchange with my MP, and what I got was a reworked press release. And I can't remember if it was business or Treasury, and my response is to say, I don't want that. You're my representative.
Yeah. Well, I think
I want to know where you stand on this. Yeah. This is particularly short time. And the thing that struck me about the response I got anyway, and this was quite striking and may open up an opportunity for us, was the final paragraph of this message from the SPAD probably, or some such, to the MP, was saying, and we will use every lever the government has available, and we will come down, we will regulate. It was big government, writ large. And the contrast between that and the government's rhetoric, I found quite surprising and stark. And I don't think that most Tory MPs, and we have one, were thinking they were going to support a big government approach. But it seems to me that there's an opportunity here for saying, come on, guys, you've forgotten this. And just to add on, this is in terms of how we, Judy, in terms of how we engage with our MPs in the system. I do vaguely wonder whether you have any hints, Josh, as to how Dominic Cummings is thinking about this. Because a lot of the things you said about how, the Treasury's mindset, and it doesn't want to, it has an aversion to this, that, and the other. These are precisely the sorts of things that I thought Cummings wanted to blow up. But this might actually be the dynamic appeal.
Rob, if you don't mind, I would really appreciate
Yes,
Joshua's answer to my original question. Do we aim at the BEIS, the Chancellor, the Treasury, or all of the above? Maybe all of the above. Maybe we say to RMP, please put this question to all of these ministers. Is that it?
I think so. I think all of the above, the more pressure you can have, the better. With regards to a tax specifically, that is the jurisdiction of the Treasury. So they're ultimately the people that decide on the tax. If it's an emissions trading scheme, that belongs to BEIS, if you like. So all of them, but Treasury essentially dictates tax policy, as does number 10. So those two I would target.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, Rob. I just wanted to make sure.
No. It's quite right, but these are related issues as to how we engage and which are the best levers to put. And the distinction between the Treasury and BES there is very helpful. So thank you.
Yeah. I guess in short, it's all of the levers are all the time, just noting that it tends to be certain departments a bit carrying more sway than the others. But yeah, we have to make use of all the people we can, I think, because it's the more people push, I think that gives us the best opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hand raised from Patrick. Does Patrick want to ask a question?
Yes, okay. Josh, you did make a comment about the government opposing CFD basically because they don't like tax. Now, I'm interested in the difference between the UK situation and the US situation because in the past, as we know, the CFD has been sort of adopted quite enthusiastically by some parts of the Republican Party, and they like it for lots of Republican ideals, meaning that it's small government, etc. So if that is the sort of argument that appeals to conservatives in America, what is the difference between the UK mindset and the American mindset?
From my perspective, there's a couple of differences in how it would be applied in the UK. So I think the appeal to American Republicans is that you get to repeal lots of the legislation and lots of the regulation, and that sort of appeals to their sort of slightly more free market approach to life. And so that's the sell. You burn the regulations in America to get, and you have the tax. That's the kind of framing. I think in the UK context, that would be a much harder sell politically as well. So you might be able to get rid of some, for example, the overlapping carbon pricing signals in the economy. You might be able to rationalize some of that. And certainly we've made suggestions how you might do that. You might combine certain taxes to make one. But getting rid of some of the broader regulations, I think, would be difficult here. I guess it's also a reflection of just how different, and this is my only view, I guess, and others may have a different view, but how different UK and American politics is. You know, where our centre right could easily fit within some parts of the, of the Democratic Party. So I think where you class the centre ground kind of dictates how people view this policy. It's sort of broadly a centre-right policy, but equally if you have the dividend, that's quite a left-leaning policy. So I don't know, it kind of borrows a bit from bits of things from different typical persuasions, which makes it could have a broader appeal.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a few questions via chat or points. Richard, I don't know if you want to ask this question yourself, you want me to read it? Richard Taylor?
Hi, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I suppose sort of picking up on the point about government doesn't like raising tax and then giving it away. I suppose is there an opportunity for the raising of the revenue fee rather than tax and distribution to be done by some sort of more arm's length regulatory body rather than overtly the government?
Yeah, so the body that is most frequently talked about is the CCC, and I think from recollection, when at their inception, they even discussed the idea of being involved with this kind of a thing where they not necessarily set fiscal policy, but they can advise on it. And I think they came to the decision that this was just too inherently political. They need to be an arm's length body, and exactly that, to keep them arm's length, to keep them independent, to keep them away from the political fray, so that they have a greater degree of autonomy, and that their findings are kind of not politicized. I think, and I was of the view that it's a nice idea that they would advise on this or be involved, but they hold such an important role within the policy landscape. You know, some people think they're a little bit too much of an extension of government. I think they're doing a fantastic job of rigorous analysis. They do it much better than most organisations of really doing the detailed systems analysis and telling government where they need to improve. And so, and to date, I guess part of their success is that they haven't been politicised. People take their findings and accept them. I think the moment you start straying into them setting some policies which might be deemed more political, you know, even though a lot of what they do is inherently political because it changes the way we conduct our lives and things like that, but setting fiscal policy might just be one step too far, I think, from a politician's perspective.
I got another, thank you. I've got another question. Does Martin want to ask this question himself, or I'll read it out? Martin? Yep. Okay. Oh, go. Oh,
You're on mute, Louisa.
I'm doing it now. Okay. I've just read that Martin did start with, he opened with, "I'm not connected by phone." So sorry about that, Martin. Josh, you mentioned public aversion to taxation. This is a highly plausible idea, and I acknowledge that it's well established in political economy. However, is it actually supported by the evidence with respect to current carbon pricing in the UK and elsewhere? I note that here in the UK, for example, the empirical reality seems to suggest the exact opposite. Hidden sources of emission tend to be undertaxed or subsidised, whereas highly visible taxes such as road fuel duty and APD tend to be among the highest. This can be verified by comparing different rates of taxation per carbon tonne equivalent of emission by emission source, and in turn by comparing those to World Bank carbon price targets. Many thanks.
Okay, it's a couple of things in there. I couldn't point to a specific piece of literature, but I think the general sentiment is that, carbon pricing aside, voters are generally don't like greater levels of taxation. The mood might be changing. I think after 10 years of austerity, people might accept higher taxes for greater public investment. I think that feels more closer to reality now. Historically, raising taxes has just been a very difficult thing to do politically. We've seen that with the fuel duty. I think Martin talks about it being a very high price already. That's true, but it's not a carbon price, not packaged as that as such. Consumers don't see a fuel duty and say that's a carbon price. They don't make that connection, even though we do make it. But you've seen once fuel duty was frozen in 2014, it hasn't been unfrozen, and no chancellor will lift that. So I think that whether that's just a political view and whether that reflects reality, I think the gap is converging somewhat, and the government might recognise that, particularly in light of COVID. I think the Chancellor will probably end up raising some taxes and hoping that consumers accept that in response to greater public investment. But generally, the literature says, and there is a paper by my colleagues did about how to make carbon prices more acceptable, where they cite the literature for people being adverse to greater levels of taxation. Although that is a slight generalisation, but that's the general principle.
Can I just pick up on your plucking chicken
Yes.
analogy?
I think I butchered the quote, so.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to butcher it some more. So I think, you know, that the chicken has been plucked so far with fuel duty and ETS and stuff like that. And I think that if we're talking about reality of the situation or and what have you, and being realistic about it, I would say that they're not going to go back on those. They've got those. They're going to keep them until there isn't anything to tax anymore on that front. But on the other hand, if you're going to pluck the chicken some more, then I mean, I think that's the whole basis of CCL, that they need to give it back. Well, the whole basis of carbon fee and dividend policy is that you need to give it back so you can carry on plucking it. Otherwise, people are going to be squawking away and you know, running around.
Yeah.
So
I found the quote. So it's John Baptist Colbert, and he says the art of taxation consists in plucking the goose as to procure the largest quantity of feathers with the least amount of hissing. And I guess that's analogous to what we're talking about, in that government want to raise that money with as little backlash as possible. Once they've done that, why would they give it away? That, I know I butchered it, but that's it was close enough.
Well, how as it's nearly 5 to 9. Perhaps, one more carbon fee and dividend question, and then because Wolfram and Minnie both want to talk, and Judy want to talk about Citizens' Assembly, perhaps have a little quick discussion about that. So a question from Louise: any countries other than Canada doing CF&D successfully?
Not that I know of. I think BC is the only one that I know of at any scale, you know, relative scale.
Yeah, we've me and James sort of heard that Switzerland have got a form of it, but it's taxed on heating oil, I think, mostly.
Yeah, so there's
heating.
The way I classify it is BC are the only one that give a dividend like a check in the post, whereas Switzerland give tax cuts off certain. You get other taxes reduced basically, and some around healthcare in Switzerland. So you don't get the same physical check in the post, which is kind of some of the arguments for the dividend idea.
The whole of Canada does, surely. That's the default.
My understanding was, I thought it was just, it could be more broadly than that.
The default position for the whole of Canada. The whole of Canada has a revenue neutral.
No, I understood that 5 provinces of Canada adopted carbon fee and dividend, and those were the 5 provinces that didn't already have some sort of a carbon tax. So I understood that 5 adopted it, but it'd be nice to know if other countries are doing it. So when we're trying to promote CF&D, it'd be nice to say these other countries are doing it successful, but I guess there aren't many doing it, or if any. Yeah.
I think that's part of the problem when policymakers look for good international examples. It's very difficult for them to draw from. In the context of COVID, one of the things colleagues were recently discussing was in America they gave helicopter payments where they gave money out to different households. So if governments could demonstrate that they could effectively do what is equivalent to the dividend part and do it well, it might it might have some degree of success and some degree of success in it, then it might help them with other plans similar to that.
I suppose if it helps, I don't know how far Ireland have got along with it, but I know they were seriously looking at a carbon tax with dividend. And again, don't know how far along with it, but I think it was Nigeria as well that CCL were having quite a lot of success with. I've got a few more points in the chat. Let's just see if there's anything else, and then we'll just quickly talk about climate income. Yeah, so James was saying Swiss government looking at evaluating dividend more fully in order to achieve their pricing ambitions. I guess that's carbon pricing ambitions. Okay, so Citizens' Assembly. Yeah, what are your thoughts then, Josh, on the the Climate Assembly?
Sure. Well, cards on the table. I've not read the full new report, so I couldn't give you any insight specifically about the findings as such. I guess the process I like the way that it kind of adds some legitimacy to the decision-making process of how legitimacy around public acceptability, I guess, of certain measures, that diverse people could come to some kind of agreement on a certain policy. My worry with the whole thing, and has been from the very beginning, is that there's no means of government to implement any of the findings from the Citizens Assembly report, anything like that. It can help inform their policy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the government are going to listen to that or enact any of those things. So I guess that's my biggest worry with it as a mechanism. It's certainly useful to gauge public acceptability of certain policies and see what types of policies are possible. The government just might not pay any attention to it, and they have no obligation to, from a kind of legal perspective or anything like that. So I guess that's, with my cynical hat on, that's my concern.
Yes, and my question would be: has anybody seen anything in the press about it?
No, actually. Is it come out, the Citizens Assembly report? I know it is this week, but
I haven't seen. I'm not probably the best person to ask on what's.
But fee and dividend weren't even raised, although we pleaded with them to do so.
This isn't so much about carbon fee and dividend in itself, Judy. It's about generally that you've got all these citizens together, and then are they actually publicising the results of doing this exercise?
Yeah.
The point is they didn't even mention carbon pricing. Several of us read a lot of the information that was delivered. They were not delivered that material.
So I think there was a report out this week. I know that much, but I just haven't read it. But I know that the frequent flyer levy was one of the policy proposals that was agreed on. That's not a carbon tax per se, but it's kind of an extension of that idea of the polluter pays. And that was one of the policies that was agreed on, which was quite interesting.
I've got a comment from Catherine. The government ignored the Citizens Assembly on social care. And Dave Waltham, he's read it. Of course, he's read it. I know he reads the UN reports as well. And the second priority out of 25 recommendations for climate justice. Do you want to expand on that, Dave? Do you want to say anything about that?
Right. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. The main thing that came out of the report was 25 recommendations of things to do, and from our point of view, 24 of them are not relevant to carbon fee and dividends. But the second one out of the 25, the second top one, they were in order of priority, was that whatever we do, we need to do it in a way that's fair to everyone, and they were very, very strong on that. So I think that's our opportunity to take it forward. As for the media reports, there was something on the BBC website, but that's the only place I saw anything. So what you're saying, I guess, is that it seems to have been ignored by the press, and I think you're right.
Ignored, or haven't they actually given it any PR budget, which would be more worrying, actually, which would also be a worry that they haven't. They said, let's just let it all go under the radar so we can ignore it. But I'm just being cynical now. We're not allowed to be cynical at CCM.
I think the press have a responsibility to report these sorts of things, whether or not there's a publicity budget.
I've heard the BBC talking about it, some audio output, either the radio or a podcast. I can't remember which.
The only thing I saw was on the website. Didn't see anything on the telly or I think it got mentioned on Radio 4 News in passing.
I'm surprised XR haven't made more of it then. But there you go. Any? Let's just have a quick look. We've got another couple of chats. Addy, do you want to talk about your letter?
Yeah, just very briefly, I wrote to my MP about 3 months ago. I only just got a letter back from the HM Treasury, a Right Honourable Jesse Norman, who claims to have strategic oversight on the UK tax system. Really annoyingly, they just say, oh, we're already doing this and aren't we great, as a short version. What I'd like to know from Josh is, well, essentially two things. One, how he suggests I respond, whether kind of, if he's met Jesse Norman, where a good leverage point is, but also just generally, I repeatedly hear this annoying response from many members of the government, where they all say, we're the first to do this, we're doing this, aren't we doing so much? And to me, it's not a race against other countries. It's not a, as I just come to the feel of it, how competitive vibes that you can give, essentially ineffective, like running over a cliff. It's not, oh yeah, well, we've got 20% there, going over the cliff.
You were breaking up a little bit there, Addy. Oh, has he gone completely? I think he might have done. No, he's still there. Do you want to come back on that then, Josh?
Yeah.
The bits you heard.
If I haven't interpreted it correctly, please shout. Jesse Norman, I don't know what the best contact is for him, I'm afraid. This is part of the problem when we're trying to start a conversation with policymakers. They move it from one person to the next, and you get a different response from someone else, and you never really quite know who's in charge of what, and then they subsequently move departments or get sacked or whatever. So that kind of thing.
I'm really sorry, Josh. I really just got back online. I got cut off.
Yes, I think you've got a dodgy internet connection there, Addy. Yeah, carry on talking, Josh.
Okay. The second question was on. Remind me.
Oh well, I can look on the chat. Let's just have a look. So I'll just read what he said. Got letter yesterday from Jesse Norman MP, Minister with Strategic Oversight of Tax System. Most of letter justifies steps taken, but it's not a race against other countries, it's a race against physics. Nice one. In same spirit, 2050 may be too late. How shall I reply to HM Treasury?
That's a difficult one to answer.
That's more of a slogan kind of thing than an economic thing, isn't it?
I guess I would say that's, in some regards, slightly flippantly, it's whatever you kind of want to communicate. There's no sort of academic thing I think you should include necessarily for that, other than calling just for greater action because the science demands it, as you've kind of outlined.
And this is the best possible solution, or it's a strong part, as you say, of the interaction. Just to check, you said the interaction of regulation, subsidy, and taxation. Is that those the three?
The balance between them.
The balance between it, because I know. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you and Ed were talking about in the US, because obviously everything we do, we have to adapt things in the US. And they're all about, this can replace stuff, this can replace regulation. They haven't got much carbon taxation, apart from, as I understand it, in different states. And so this is the free way of doing everything for you. And I think in the UK, we do have regulation, we do have some taxation. So yeah, we've got to kind of look at a bit more of an interaction there.
I think so. The best way to look at it is holistically. It would have made it much more difficult for coal to make the economic case as competitive for alternatives if we didn't have a regulation on how much on the large plant combustion directive. So we needed those regulations in addition. It makes it makes that transition much more efficient and quick, I think.
Carrots and sticks.
Yes, absolutely.
Carrots and sticks and plucking gooses.
I'm glad if there's any, you can ignore everything I've said tonight and just take that one metaphor. I'll be pleased with that.
Great. Right, one more. Should we have one more quote from where's that gone then? I had a little thing pop up and then it's gone away because it doesn't like me today. Let's just have a look. Maybe quoting the climate justice being the second priority for climate assembly, hot off the presses piece of info. Yes.
Yeah, I
exactly.
I think the fairness argument is a very good one for carbon pricing. What you're doing is confronting the polluters and internalizing that cost and making them pay. So the fairness argument and the justice argument is central to what carbon pricing is about. It's fair and it's efficient. And certainly that's an argument that should be made. It's often the poorest communities that are worse affected by the impacts of climate change, yet it's not them who are causing it. So the carbon price corrects for that. So that's part of the argument, I think. Yes,
and our conservative. Well, if we're talking about small c conservatism, that this idea of fairness and that people paying for their own mess is very strong in British culture too. Okay, anybody got any last questions? Well, I think before we let Josh go, as it's 9:10. Any more? One more question.
Louise Grimm was looking for a chance.
Louise, did you have anything further you wanted to add?
Okay.
No, thanks.
Great. Glad we answered that. Okay.
Louise,
sorry,
yeah. Can I just do a very quick bit of admin? Josh, that was absolutely brilliant. We've recorded it. If people want the link, it'll get posted, email into me, and I can send out the link for this recording, which means people like AD, if you